Greetings. This is chapter 11 of Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx contra Engels. I'm really enjoying this book thus far. Thanks for listening. The chapter's titled Scientific Socialism as National Messianism. On the philosophic level, the distinctions between Marx and Engels were pronounced. Not only were they major, but the distinctions were readily observable. Engels' mechanistic materialism stood in clear contrast to Marx's naturalistic humanism and his concept of praxis. On the philosophical level, a Marxian center of gravity and an Engelsian center of gravity can be delineated. On the practical level, the realm of party and political tactics, the distinctions remained hidden. There seemed to be unanimity of viewpoint. Closer examination will reveal, however, that Engels interpreted the strategy and development of the proletarian movement in Europe and Asia in a fashion radically different from the intent and spirit of Marx. An attempt will be made to explain why on the tactical level the appearance of unanimity was given, when in fact, in the more subtle and theoretical ranges of tactical thinking, major disparity was the case. In discussing this question, the concept of tactics must be divided into applied and theoretic. The term, quote, applied tactics, is meant to incorporate everyday questions of strategy, decision-making within realistic political configurations. The term, quote, theoretic tactics, is meant to incorporate the goal and end of the proletarian movement, the consummation of victories of applied tactics. Marx and Engels were in general agreement on the question of applied tactics. They were not in general agreement on the theoretical level of tactics. It is my opinion that the differences over theoretic tactics between Marx and Engels corresponded exactly to the larger philosophical differences between the two men. In terms of applied tactics, Marx and Engels both agreed that a separate proletarian party was a political necessity if the workers were to emancipate themselves. They both felt that the leadership of the proletarian party should be drawn from the workers themselves. Neither Marx nor Engels was a Leninist, since neither wanted a non-proletarian professional elitist intelligentsia leading the working classes. Both men believed in the cataclysmic theory of revolution, that is, that capitalism would collapse because of capitalism's inherent tendency to bring about industrial anarchy to overproduce. Both men thought that the bourgeois classes must be violently overthrown. They believed that only force or compulsion, power in the hands of the industrial workers, could effect and institute the radical changes the proletariat demanded. A revolution, this forceful execution of proletarian wishes, was needed to usher in communism. Throughout their lives, Marx and Engels continued to believe in, to extol, the revolutionary nature of the working masses. Throughout their lives, Marx and Engels continued to see Tsarist Russia as the bulwark of European reaction, while at the same time feeling that Imperial Russia was ripe for social revolution. Both men had a sound grasp of European imperialism and understood that European colonialism was engendering a social revolution in Asia. The list is not exhaustive. There were other areas of agreement between Marx and Engels, but this list tells us a great deal. It tells us that the agreement on applied tactics was the real basis for the assumption that Marx and Engels were in agreement generally. In addition, in the 1880s and 1890s, Engels responded almost intuitively. He carried on a voluminous correspondence with the leadership of these parties. Some of the correspondence was personal, most of it was pedagogical, intended to instruct and to guide in questions of strategy and political options. Furthermore, a large part of Engels' writing during this period was not done as an objective or disinterested theoretic pursuit. He wrote in response to the political requirements of the European Marxist movement. He made attempts to offer clarification and elucidation of Marxist thought, as well as polemic attempts to defend the Marxist movement from critics and detractors. Anti-Düring, for instance, was written to defend Marxian materialism, as Engels understood Marxian materialism, from the late 19th century revival of idealism. Socialism, Scientific and Utopian was written as a high-level political pamphlet. Socialism, Scientific and Utopian was a popular venture composed for the express purpose of explaining Marxism to the French working classes. In these works, Engels tended to stress the unanimity between himself and Marx. Thus, the foundation was laid for the belief that Marx and Engels spoke with one voice. Nevertheless, this surface appearance of unanimity was not only deceiving, but can be dispelled. Even though there was general agreement between Marx and Engels on applied tactics, on the theoretic level, Engels' tactics complemented his unilinear view of history, while Marx's tactics complemented his multilinear view of history. Engels' strategy for revolution in the 19th century was influenced by his macrocosmic deterministic scheme of historical development. Although Marx and Engels agreed on specific points, on the level of the theory of tactics, Engels was confined to the concept of the inevitability of the communist revolution in Europe, to the loss of revolutionary praxis, to the loss of revolutionary elan, to the idealistic expectation that the hard laws of social evolution would produce the communist revolution. In other words, Engels' tactics corroborated his economic determinism. On the other hand, on the level of the theory of tactics, Marx's viewpoint corroborated his multilinear view of history. For Engels, the communist revolution would produce itself rather than be fashioned by conscious men. The revolution would start during an economic depression. The capitalist order had created a world market. The class struggle had been globalized, between proprietor and worker, or between capitalist nation and proletarian nation. In both its national and global dimensions, the capitalist mode of production was planless, unorganized, anarchic. The inherent anarchy of capitalist production led inevitably to overproduction. The economic depression, the economic cataclysm that would free the socialist revolution would arise from overproduction. Pauperization would make the workers rebel. Misery was the cause of political insurrection. The inevitable economic crisis of the capitalist order would lead to the pauperization of the working class. The polarization of the stricken society between the few rich and the many poor, the irreconcilability of class warfare. Throughout his life, Engels maintained a profound faith in the industrial masses. Engels saw in them the indispensable as well as committed cadres of social revolution. Engels tended to romanticize the pauper. He remained wedded to Moses Hess's idolization of the impoverished, of the ancient struggle of poor against rich. The communist revolution, for Engels, was the revolution of the pauperized. Proletariat, for Engels, meant the poor. Because of socioeconomic conditions, the communist revolution must be violent. Embittered and polarized class warfare meant that the wealthy would not willingly surrender their class privileges, i.e. the ownership of productive property. Therefore, force must be used. Productive property must be forcibly taken from the possessing classes. Class compulsion, a proletarian state, would not only be used to expropriate property from the capitalists, but a proletarian state would be necessary to repress the remnants of the bourgeoisie during the communist revolution. A working class state, or an instrument of political coercion, controlled by the proletariat, was as much a necessity for Engels as the use of violence to initially topple the bourgeois class at the beginning of the pauper revolution. Only after private ownership of the means of production was ended, only after the class enemies of the proletariat were stilled, would the state, quote, wither away, end quote. Nevertheless, even though philosophically and theoretically Engels continuously affirmed the theme of political revolution and class struggle, after 1871, what Engels did and advised not only was non-revolutionary, but also led to the loss of revolutionary elan in the Western European working classes, basing our judgments upon what Engels wanted done instead of what he literally affirmed. The tactics of Engels led to the replacement of the revolution by mechanistic determinism, to the replacement of conscious praxis by the faith in inevitabilism, to the replacement of class warfare by parliamentarianism. Engels was directly responsible for the evolutionism and accommodationism of the Second International. In the area of tactics, as in the area of philosophy and ideology, Engels attempted to steer a middle course between two extremes. On his left stood the anarchists. To Engels' credit, with a greater grasp of political reality, Engels kept the separation between socialism and anarchism. He successfully fought against the extreme voluntarism of the anarchists, their easy resort to terror, their mythic conception of the immediate overthrow of the state. On his right stood the Fabians and Possibilists and Lassalleans, all those who adopted a policy of social reformism. Against these forces, Engels continued to talk in terms of revolution, a fundamental social structural change, of proletarian insurrection. In this sense, Engels protected the integrity and independence of the Marxist social movement, but he laid the foundation for Kautsky and Babel. The sum total of his political writing produced a heritage that supported and encouraged the gradualism and non-revolutionary policies of the Second International. The images that Engels had in mind as he calculated the revolutionary situation after 1871 were the revolutions of 1848 and 1871. But Engels faced a unique revolutionary situation after 1871. Above all, the errors of the past must be avoided. Both in 1848 and in 1871, the proletarian movement had suffered severe setbacks. Towards the end of the century, Engels grew cautious. The socialist movement had come back to life, and Engels was primarily concerned with avoiding any action that would jeopardize what he felt was the assured continued growth of the proletarian movement. Specifically, as Engels faced the reality of the post-1871 world, he accepted a series of political parameters. In short, he accepted a horizon of historical givens, and the applied tactics he advocated after 1871 conformed to these, as he saw them, historical givens. These were 6 political parameters. 1. Armed insurrections were a thing of the past. 2. War should be avoided. 3. A bourgeois republic was the most favorable political environment in which a revolution could move progressively leftward. 4. A separate proletarian party was a necessity. 5. The territorial structure of a national state was an indispensable factor for the outbreak of proletarian revolution. 6. The revolutionary as well as reactionary potential of Russia must be taken into account. The new method of proletarian struggle was through parliamentarian elections. In his 1895 introduction to Marx's Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, Engels affirmed that rebellion in the old style, the street fight with barricades, which up to 1848 gave everywhere the final decision, was to a considerable extent obsolete. Engels is aware of the growth of military power at the disposal of the state. As long as the army remained loyal to the state would have preponderant military power over any attempted insurrection from the street. In addition, Engels was also opposed to external wars. Because the bourgeois states of Western Europe and the feudal aristocratic states of Eastern Europe controlled the balance of military power, armed insurrection and revolutionary warfare could easily be put down, the progressive forces destroyed, and consequently capitalist and feudal conservatism strengthened. In short, Engels believed the 2 revolutionary instruments used by the proletarian movement in the past, armed urban insurrection and revolutionary warfare, were no longer applicable to the conditions of the late 19th century. But the ending of the usefulness of armed insurrection and warfare did not mean the ending of proletarian struggle in itself. Fortunately, the spread of suffrage rights had opened up a new arena of proletarian struggle. Class struggle would continue, but only in a new mode. The replacement of the heroism of the street by the heroism of the ballot box required that socialist parties throughout Europe have 2 levels to their party programs. On the philosophical level, these socialist parties must affirm the need of a structural revolution. They must affirm that only a proletarian seizure of power, even though it entailed violence, could place in the hands of the proletariat the needed power to carry out their social goals. On the other hand, Engels stated, it was necessary for these socialist parties to also have immediate demands. The battle of the ballot box required socialist parties to win votes. Immediate demands, the redress of specific sources of proletarian or other underprivileged class distress, would act as a vote-getting device. On the basis of immediate demands, socialist parties must take part in the parliamentarian struggle between classes. They must form temporary alliances with parliamentarian groups and in this way try to ensure victory for the demands of these groups with the full understanding that such a victory would enhance the possibilities of a final proletarian takeover. Engels' program called for a series of temporary tactical alliances, but it was alliance politics without illusion. Within the framework of the battle of the ballot box, these tactical alliances would be understood as merely temporary. It would also be understood that as soon as the purpose of a tactical coalition had been attained, the socialists would immediately break the alliance and form another opposition. Finally, a revolutionary situation would come into existence. The model that Engels had in mind when he thought of revolution was France in 1789. Like Marx, Engels assumed that the events of 1789 was the archetypal pattern of all revolutions. For Engels, the revolutions moved to the left. They began moderately, but were increasingly radicalized as different classes in society, consistently moving toward the poorer strata, took political power. The proletarian revolution of the future would assume the same pattern. At the final moment, Engels believed, a society in a revolutionary condition would be completely polarized. Quote, in any case, our sole adversary on the day of the crisis and on the day after the crisis will be the whole collective reaction which will group itself around pure democracy, and this, I think, should not be lost sight of, end quote. Such an absolute duality was the hallmark of a revolutionary crisis for Engels, but it could only be reached after the intermediary classes had been destroyed or forced to one or the other of the extreme sides. Engels' concept of revolution was the permanent revolution, the revolution that continued until it came to rest in the most unfortunate class in all society, the class that would liberate society generally from all oppression, the proletariat. The revolution that moved to the left would more readily unfold within a bourgeois republic, according to Engels. A parliamentarian form of government based upon wide suffrage rights had contributed to the radicalization of the French revolutions of 1789 and 1848. Toward the end of the 19th century, Engels adamantly maintained that a bourgeois republic would not only facilitate the outbreak of revolution, but would also facilitate the movement of that revolution to its proletarian culmination. For these reasons, Engels argued until his death in 1895 that socialists must support representative republics. They must follow this tactic not out of dedication to the principles of representative government, but out of knowledge that republican systems provided more opportunity for proletarian conquest of power. Even though Engels favored temporary alliances, Engels never wished to compromise the political independence or the doctrinal purity of the separate and autonomous Socialist Party. When August Bebel and Ferdinand Lassalle opened negotiations for the possible fusion of their two parties, Engels was at first very cool to the eventuality. He wrote to Bebel that the Social Democratic Workers' Party had, quote, absolutely nothing to learn from the Lassalleans in the theoretical sphere and therefore in what is decisive for the program, end quote. Engels' position called for the continued separate existence of the Social Democratic Workers' Party rather than tamper with or dilute the doctrinal purity of the party. Both Marx and Engels were to reiterate this same view approximately 4 years later. In the famous circular letter to Bebel, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and W. Brache of September 17 to 18, 1879, Marx and Engels again opposed any compromise with the Lassalleans and stated that it was impossible for them and should be impossible for the Social Democratic Workers' Party, quote, to cooperate with people who wish to expunge this class struggle from the movement, end quote. Marx and Engels were in agreement on all these points, which were essentially a continuation of the ideas expressed in Marx's address to the Central Committee of to the Communist League, 1850, in which he asserted that the working classes must carry out their own emancipation. In his voluminous correspondence with Edward Bernstein, Karl Kautsky, August Bebel, Paul and Laura Lafargue, Engels stressed repeatedly that a workers' party must lead the socialist movement. When Engels talked of the working class, he meant those who labored in large industrial plants. Proletariat for Engels meant industrial workers or those who labored, quote, in the great industrial cities, end quote. There was a difference, according to Engels, between the industrial worker and the hand weavers of Saxony. Quote, these people, bracket, Saxony hand weavers, end bracket, find themselves in an economically reactionary situation, representatives of a decaying level of production. Therefore, the Saxon hand weavers are not to the same degree born representatives of revolutionary socialism as the worker in great industry, end quote, Engels. Labor unions were the natural organization for an industrial proletariat. The backbone of a working men's party would be formed by labor unions. Engels and Marx as well tended to overestimate the revolutionary nature of the industrial proletariat. They both manifested a failure of realism, a tendency to romanticize the revolutionary virtues of the industrial workers. Engels glorified the masses. Engels tended to see them as possessing a, quote, instinctive drive, end quote, for socialism. Engels recognized that they were not as incisive in their thinking as the individual leaders of the party or labor unions. Nevertheless, the working masses were still, quote, much better than all the leaders put together, end quote. Even though they were slower to learn, their consciousness would rise to a proletarian consciousness eventually. Only patience was needed. Then, the acquired communist consciousness of the industrial workers, plus his inherent heroism and his inherent uncorruptibility, would make the communist revolution a certainty. From this point of view, Engels affirmed again and again that bourgeois and petty bourgeois intellectuals should be eliminated from the Workers' Party. Property-owning elements could not understand the interests of the proletariat. Generally, they were less militant. They were given to compromise. They were prone to think in legalistic and institutional terms rather than in terms of class struggle. Engels displayed a profound distrust not of intelligence, but of the bourgeois intellectual. The preservation of the idea of class struggle, the preservation of the proletarian core of the socialist movement, entailed for Engels and for Marx the exclusion of bourgeois elements from the Socialist Party. What Engels feared, as well as Marx, was the embourgeoisement of the proletariat. Capitalist economies seemed to have found in the national state the best political form of its most expansive growth. The best chance of success for the communist revolution was to unfold within a national territorial unit, and then spread from one country to the next. For instance, both Marx and Engels, beginning in the 1870s, thought it likely that a revolution would begin first inside the Russian state and then subsequently spread to the German state. In addition, the First International Working Men's Association, according to Marx, was never meant to co-opt the independence of national socialist parties. Rather, the International was intended to coordinate and to guide the sovereign acts of the national socialist parties. Engels agreed after Marx's death continued to perpetuate and after Marx's death continued to perpetuate the policy of autonomous national parties. Engels' own opinions on this matter were clearly stated in his March 18th to 22nd, 1875 letter to Bebel, in which he said that, quote, ... although the German Workers' Party is operating first of all within the state boundaries laid down for the German Workers' Party, the German Workers' Party had no right to speak in the name of the European proletariat, and especially no right to say something false, end parenthesis. It is conscious of its solidarity with the workers of all countries and will always be ready hereafter, as it has been hitherto, to fulfill the obligation imposed upon it by this solidarity, end quote. On no point were Marx and Engels more insistent than on the preservation of the idea of class struggle within the doctrine and policies of the separate national proletarian parties. Only the idea of the class struggle, of the irreconcilability of interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, could produce a revolution, and only a revolution could give to the proletariat the political power necessary to carry out its reforms. In their circular letter to Bebel, Liebknecht, and Brache, Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, for almost 40 years we have stressed the class struggle as the immediate driving power of history, and in particular the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat as the great lever of the modern social revolution, end quote. Engels held this position from 1842 onward and articulated it again in his October 28, 1882 letter to Bebel. However, the prospects of revolution in Europe could not be adequately weighed without an analysis of the role of Russia. Engels believed that a continental war must be avoided. Russia was the bulwark of aristocratic conservatism. Pan-Slavism was a strong element within the circles around the Tsar. A Russian victory in Europe would thus enlarge the Tsarist imperium. The smaller and weaker Slavic states of Eastern Europe would be absorbed by the great Slavic motherland. Secondly, a German defeat would entail the destruction of the German socialist movement. Russian conservation would resort to the same, or even harsher, repressive measures as Bismarck had attempted in his anti-socialist crusade. In either case, a Russian victory would be another setback for the European revolutionary movement. On the other hand, Engels believed that Russia was ripe for revolution. Peace, then, was what Europe needed, according to Engels. Peace to allow the revolution to come to the surface in Russia. Peace to allow the German Socialist Party to grow to the largest in Western Europe, so it could powerfully join and lead the revolutionary movement as it flowed out of the East. Engels' main concern was the preservation of the gains made by socialism in Western Europe since 1871. Engels was an essentially non-adventurous policy. It was distinctly conservative. Engels' applied tactics were not meant to be rigid and inflexible. Although Engels had definite ideas about the broad pattern of the revolutionary movement, from the economic backdrop of capitalism to the installation of a proletarian state, he never assumed that the proletarian movement in every nation must imitate exactly the same specific pattern of growth. On December 28, 1886, Engels wrote to Florence Vishnevetsky that, quote, our theory is not a dogma but the exposition of a process of evolution, and that process involves successive phases, end quote. About a month later, he again expressed similar sentiments to Florence Vishnevetsky when he wrote that, quote, there's a typo here. Or it looks like. Yeah. About a month later, he again expressed similar sentiments to Florence Vishnevetsky when he wrote that, quote, our theory is a theory of evolution, not a dogma to be learned by heart and to be repeated mechanically, end quote. Oh, no. That's not a typo. That's me being stupid. To Bebel, he wrote on November 19th, 1892, that it was, quote, nonsense to expect the movement in variant countries to conform to one pattern, end quote. On the level of his theory of tactics, on the level of his philosophy of history, Engels was a dogmatist. The general pattern of historical development must be unilinear. The general pattern of historical development was governed by the laws of economic determinism. On the level of applied tactics, in terms of temporary political strategy, Engels proved to be flexible. There could be specific variations to the general law of growth. Because of these specific variations, applied tactical flexibility was required. Engels used the supplied theory of revolution as a criterion by which to judge the French, English, Russian, and German socialist movements. The revival of the socialist movement in the 1880s made Engels' assessment of them assume climactic historical importance. Engels died only 19 years before the outbreak of World War I. His evaluation of these socialist parties, of their role and importance, thus had extremely weighty bearing on the policies of the Second International in the years and days immediately preceding the outbreak of the war. In particular, Engels' attitude toward the German Socialist Party, his close contacts with Kautsky, Bebel, and Liebknecht, formed the framework in which the German Socialist Party operated from 1895 until 1914. What Engels thought about Germany, what Engels thought about Russia, was an unchallenged heritage that Kautsky, Bebel, and Liebknecht voluntarily accepted. The principles upon which these men acted in August 1914 were the principles first enunciated and defended by Engels. In his letters to Paul and Laure Lafargue, Engels commented extensively on the French socialist movement. The great enemy in France was the possibilists led by Paul Brousse. Even though critical of the erratic personality of Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, husband of Laura Marx, Engels supported the French Workers' Party of Jules Guesde and Lafargue. The French Workers' Party was a true Marxist party, while the possibilists were merely bourgeois reformers masquerading as socialists. The possibilists were the classic example of a socialist party composed mostly of bourgeois intellectuals. In condemning the possibilists, Engels not only reaffirmed his opposition to the embourgeoisement of the socialist movement, but also editorially rejected evolutionism as a theoretical or applied possibility for the socialist movement. In short, Engels did not think evolutionism was a valid Marxian concept. Engels, in terms of rhetoric, remained bound to revolutionism. In 1889, however, the possibilists had gained the position of representing the socialist movement in France. On March 27th of that year, Engels wrote to Lafargue, severely admonishing him for the tactical blunders that had permitted the possibilists to be, quote, in sole possession of the field, end quote, and urging him to accept the German offer of an international congress at which the possibilists would be read out and the Lafargue-Guesde party read in as the true representatives of socialism in France. Lafargue conceded Engels' advice, and in 1889 the Second International met in Paris under the leadership of the German Social Democratic Party. The Brousse groups, however, did not sit with the Second International, but met in a separate hall as a show of opposition to the International and the Lafargue-Guesde faction. Engels was opposed to any mediation between the International and Brousse, and as Engels wished, the Paris International conferred upon the French Workers' Party the mantle of representing the socialist forces in France. Interestingly, Paul Brousse had received the support of Henry Hyndman and the English Social Democratic Federation. The struggle against Brousse, as well as the struggle against Hyndman and the Fabians, was a struggle for Engels against reformism. According to Engels, Brousse, Hyndman, the Fabians were really cut from the same cloth as Ferdinand Lassalle. All were revisionists. The Paris victory was a great one for Engels because it affirmed the idea of class struggle and revolution in all socialist programs. However, another obstacle remained in France, which prevented, quote, the formation of an independent working men's party, end quote. The obstacle was Boulangerism. Engels defining Boulangerism in the following terms, quote, but it's the third time that such an aberration occurs since 1789. The first time since Napoleon I, second time Napoleon III, was carried to the top by that wave of aberration. And now it's a worse creature than either. But fortunately the force of the wave, too, is broken. Anyhow, we must apparently come to the conclusion that the negative side of the Parisian revolutionary character, chauvinistic Bonapartism, is as essential to it as a positive side, and then after every great revolutionary effort, we may have to have a recrudescence of Bonapartism, of an appeal to a savior, ... end quote. Boulangerism was one of the enemies on the right against which Engels fought. Many working class people in Paris supported Boulanger. I don't know who this person is. Boulanger. And Engels proclaimed the need of socialists to expose Boulanger and thus win these working class people back into the fold of socialism. Paul Lafargue himself had shown some sympathy for the Boulangerist movement. Lafargue was aware of the appeal that Boulanger had for the proletariat and wished to exploit Boulanger in the interest of the socialist movement. Engels' attitude was unmitigated opposition, and Engels accused Lafargue of hurting the cause of socialism in France by his public display of sympathy for Boulanger. Boulanger stood for French chauvinism, for revanche, for, quote, Alsace conquered, end quote. Alsace reconquered, end quote. The collapse of Boulanger had created the conditions for a sound proletarian movement inside France. In fact, quote, the monarchist attack on the Republic has failed, end quote. The bourgeois Republic had been stabilized. According to Engels' theory of revolution, the bourgeois Republic was the most conducive environment for the growth and development of a proletarian movement. Engels looked upon the parliamentarian republic as the last defense of the bourgeoisie in general. Indeed, Engels' letters to Lafargue after the fall of Boulanger reflect this optimism. He anticipated the gradual but steady polarization of the various parties within the bourgeois republic. Engels anticipated that the bourgeois republic would be increasingly radicalized, that this would be continuous and permanent movement to the left until a position of unreconcilable confrontation had been reached, a revolutionary situation. When Engels described the future development of the Republic in France, the model that he had in mind was the Great French Revolution of 1789. Engels envisioned the increasing polarization and radicalization of the Third Republic. Like the Revolution of 1789, the Third Republic would move to the left. Monarchists would give way to the conservative rule, and conservative would be replaced by bourgeois rule. When the workers confronted the bourgeoisie with implacable resolve, the party bourgeoisie would join the entire bourgeois camp. Thus two great armed camps would face each other, the camp of the status quo and the revolutionary camp of workers and peasants. This state of categorical opposition was the revolutionary condition. When looking at the proletarian movement in England from the vantage point of 1892, Engels had reason to be hopeful. In 13 years, from 1879 until 1892, there had been considerable growth. 3 years before his death, Engels saw an independent working men's party in England that had begun to win electoral victories. Engels had every expectation that Keir Hardie's Independent Labour Party would continue to win at the polls and, through their electoral triumphs, emerge as a serious political threat to the Tories and Liberals. However, in 1879, Engels wrote to Edward Bernstein that, quote, a workers' movement in the continental sense does not exist in England, end quote. Engels understood that the English working class had been co-opted by the prosperity stemming from British imperialism, and on September 12, 1882, said so in a letter to Kautsky. British domination of the world market had kept English industry flourishing, had kept employment high, and consequently had kept the industrial proletariat satisfied. Prosperity, then, was one reason why the English worker had not formed an independent workers' party, but preferred to remain a tail of the Liberal Party. Engels anticipated that the collapse of British domination of the world market would bring unemployment, proletarian distress, and renewed proletarian vigor and independence. One second. Get some coffee. In the 1882 period, before a true proletarian party developed, the representative of English socialism was Henry Hyndman's Social Democratic Federation, and later the Fabians. Engels had nothing but scorn for the Social Democratic Federation and the Fabians. To Engels, they represented the worst of middle-class socialism. They did not understand the suffering of the workers, and therefore could not adequately represent political interests of the workers. Furthermore, the political program of the Social Democratic Federation and the Fabians were both un-Marxian. Hyndman, Engels maintained, was in actuality an ex-conservative party member, as well as a chauvinist. The Social Democratic Federation, according to Engels, was not a party at all, but merely an amalgam of confused sects, the remains of the great movement of the 1840s. The Fabians, too, were composed of bourgeois intellectuals and were dedicated to evolutionist thought. Engels in 1892 was severely critical of Edward Bernstein's interest in the Fabians. Engels referred to Bernstein's, quote, Fabian romanticism, end quote, and indicated that Bernstein's interest in the Fabians was probably an expression of Bernstein's, quote, sickness, end quote. The evolutionary thought of the Fabians was irreconcilable to the Marxist revolutionary message. In 1888, unemployment had come to England, Out of the poverty of the worker, proletarian militancy began to grow. The trade union movement was resuscitated. In 1890, the London dock strike was won. Engels called the London dock strike, quote, the greatest event in England since both previous reform bills, end quote. On May 4, 1890, there were mass worker demonstrations in Hyde Park. To Engels, it seemed clear that the old bourgeois social sects had been bypassed, and the newer and greater layers of workers were being drawn into the socialist movement. On the 9th of May, 1890, Engels wrote to Babel that in England, quote, on May 4th, there had begun a real socialist mass movement, end quote. Out of this mass discontent, an independent workers' party had developed, the party of Keir Hardie and John Burns. In 1892, Hardie and Burns won seats in the House of Commons as Labour representatives. Thus the battle of the ballot box had worked to the advantage of the socialists. Engels could only anticipate that the use of his electoral strategy would bring continued victories to the working class. Although Engels philosophized about revolution, although Engels would never compromise a socialist program by dropping the idea, the call for revolution, in point of fact, the class war for Engels would develop on the basis of electoral victories. The ideas that Engels himself condemned in the revisionists were the ideas that Engels in fact advocated in actuality. The ideas that Engels himself condemned in the revisionists were the ideas that he in fact advocated in actuality. Russia occupied a rather ambiguous place in Engels' thought. On the one hand, Russia was the bulwark of European reaction. As the major conservative power on the continent, its presence meant that no proletarian victory was possible in Western Europe. Engels remembered the Russian intervention in the 1848 to 1849 revolution, and how her aid in suppressing the Hungarian rebellion was instrumental in preserving the Habsburg dynasty. Engels assumed that a conservative Tsarist Russia would take similar action if a proletarian revolution were to break out in Western Europe at the end of the 19th century. On the other hand, Engels is aware that Russia was ripe for revolution. The two decisive turning points in 19th century Russian history were the Crimean War and the emancipation of the serf in 1861. The defeat in the Crimean War showed the decadence of the Tsarist system, and the liberation of the serfs prepared the social foundation for a future revolution. Quote, this great act of emancipation, which was so universally acclaimed and praised by the liberal press of Europe, has created nothing but the foundations and the absolute necessity of a future revolution, end quote, Engels. Like Marx, Engels was certain that a revolution was coming to Russia. The problem that perplexed Engels was what kind of revolution this would be. Engels had a vehement dislike of pan-Slavism. Engels saw it as a tool of Tsarist reaction. The Mir, the Russian communal village, was a favorite social institution of the pan-Slav populace. They saw in the preservation of the Mir an opportunity to prevent the horrors of capitalism from coming to Russia, an opportunity to build a communal society in general starting from the communal nature of the Mir. To Engels' mind, the Mir was simply a figment of pan-Slav romantic conservative ideology. Just as pan-Slavism was the creed of conservative bourgeois intellectuals, so the Mir as a social institution was not only conservative but outdated. To Engels' mind, the Mir was a vestige of ancient pre-capitalist society. The communal village was a typical form of socioeconomic organization in ancient civilizations like India, Java, and Western Europe, as well as Russia. Engels was quick to point out, however, that capitalism had destroyed the communal village in Western Europe. He further pointed out that capitalist imperialism was in the process of destroying the village community in India and Java as well. Therefore, he concluded that capitalist development would destroy the Mir in Russia. There was no historically documented reason to argue that Russia differed from all the other sectors of the globe, that it alone could escape the ravages of capitalism and preserve the village commune. Secondly, the Mir, in Engels' eyes, represented a low stage of historical development. Engels believed in necessitarian stages of development, history moved from lower to higher. Capitalism for Engels represented the highest state of productive capacity yet attained by man. Thus the law of monodeveloped growth, required that a lower stage of historical development be replaced by a higher stage of historical development. That had been the course taken by Western Europe. If historical laws had any validity, they did according to Engels, Russia must follow the path of Western Europe. Russia must move from primitive society to capitalist society, and the Mir must be destroyed. Consequently, the revolution was imminent in Russia. The revolution that was imminent in Russia was not the proletarian revolution. Rather, it was the bourgeois revolution. Autocracy must first be overthrown. A constitutional democratic order must be established. An electoral system must be established. Capitalism must create the class war in the countryside. Only after a representative national life had been created could a proletarian movement begin. Quote, and it signifies the beginning of an active internal national life for the Russian people and simultaneously the beginning of a real workers' movement in Russia, end quote. Even though the bourgeois revolution would rid Russia of czarist autocracy, it would not necessarily release the revolutionary movement in Western Europe. Engels was well aware of bourgeois hatred of the proletarian class. Just as the Tsar would intervene to repress working-class revolution in the West, so the Western capitalists would intervene in Russia to support a bourgeois capitalist government. The subsequent proletarian revolution in Russia would, however, release the revolutionary potential of Western Europe. With czarist and then capitalist conservatism removed, the working classes of Western Europe would rebel. A workers' insurrection in Russia would thus be the signal for a workers' insurrection in the West. A workers' insurrection in Russia, if Russia were still a relatively undeveloped capitalist state, could not alone lead directly to communism in Russia. Following a workers' revolution in Russia, a workers' revolution in more technologically advanced and more capitalized Western Europe, with its eastern border secured, could lead directly to communism. Not only could the Western workers build communism in their own countries, but they could extend assistance to the Russian worker. With the help of the West, with the guidance of the West, but not alone, the Russian worker could build communism. Engels again reaffirmed the leadership, the higher stage of evolutionary development of Western Europe. If Russia was the most problematical state in Europe as far as the socialist movement was concerned, Germany in Engels' eyes was the most well-defined. The fate of German socialism and the fate of international socialism were one, according to Engels. In 1883, Engels wrote to Edward Bernstein that the German Social Democratic Party must preserve its, quote, unique position as representative of international socialism, end quote. Thus, German socialism assumed a messianic mission. Its success entailed the success of the socialist movement around the world. Until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, France had been the center of the European socialist movement. The defeat of the Paris Commune ended that revolutionary tradition. When the socialist movement revived again, Germany became the center of energy. In his famous introduction to the 1895 introduction of Marx's class struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, Engels wrote that the, quote, War of 1870 to 71 and the defeat of the Commune had transformed the center of gravity of the European workers' movement for the time being from France to Germany, as Marx foretold, end quote, Engels. The center of gravity of world socialism was to remain in Germany. Excuse me. Sorry, I have COVID. One reason why German socialism would retain its messianic mission was because of the rapid proletarianization of the German laboring masses. The Industrial Revolution, the production of a downtrodden industrial working class, was proceeding with greater thoroughness and depth in Germany than had been the case in either England or France. To begin with, Germany had a larger population than either England or France. Secondly, Germany had retained Germany's small peasant proprietary class into the 1880s, as well as its hand weavers and other artisans. The rigorous and complete capitalization of Germany meant, therefore, the destruction of the small peasant proprietor and the artisans. Of greater number, the former peasants and artisans would find their economic functions destroyed, would find themselves forced to join the industrial laboring force. The experience would serve to radicalize this new German proletariat. Thirdly, by the 1880s, England's monopoly on the world market had been broken by the United States and Germany. The penetration of Germany into the world market meant greater economic opportunity, and thus further industrialization inside Germany to meet these new markets. An additional reason why Germany would hold on to its leadership role in world socialism was the test of strength and hardening it had endured under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. From 1878 until 1890, Bismarck, short of absolute prohibition, attempted to legislate the German Social Democratic Party out of existence. The Social Democrats weathered the storm, whereas other national parties might have been broken, and Engels thought this a testament to the will, dedication, discipline, and militancy of the German proletariat. The German Socialist Party was a stronger party because it had overcome the oppression of the anti-socialist laws. Engels' optimism, his faith in the ultimate triumph of German socialism, was manifested by his belief that Bismarck was inadvertently doing the work of the German socialists. That is, Engels believed that Bismarck's policies were exacerbating the class struggle in Germany, demonstrating the repressive nature of the monarchy and bourgeoisie, demonstrating through state socialism some of the attractive points of socialism to the working class, and thus enhancing the objective conditions that would eventually lead to proletarian socialism. But the most important reason why the German socialists would continue to be the leading revolutionary class in Europe was due to their excellent grasp of theory. The theoretical superiority of the Germans meant that only the Germans were truly capable of understanding Marx, and thus only the Germans were capable of writing a socialist program that embodied the idea of Marx. Presumably, the theoretical excellence of the German workers also meant that the tactics of the German workers would adhere more faithfully to the tactics of Marx. For instance, the German workers would not be as indifferent or as uninspired as the English workers were in the late 1870s. The German workers would not fall prey to other misguided creeds that promised to redress their ills as the French workers had fallen prey to Proudhonism. What Engels was suggesting was that the leadership of international socialism did in fact belong in Germany because only Germans had the intellectual background necessary to properly exercise this leadership. Engels then watched the growth of the German Social Democratic Party with joy and anticipation. The extension of the suffrage had given the workers a new weapon, a new field of battle. As Engels watched the electoral growth of the Socialist Party, Engels considered this tantamount to the coming of the proletarian revolution. Electoral victories took the place of actual revolutionary tactics. Even though Engels would have denied it, he contributed immensely to the de-revolutionizing of Marxism. The real electoral growth of the German Social Democratic Party began in the election of 1884. The gains of the Socialists signified a breakthrough for them as a political force. Engels wrote to Bernstein that the, quote, election of 1884 was for us what the 1866 was for the German Philistine, end quote. But the election of 1890 was the real turning point. Not only did it witness the end of the anti-socialist laws, but the election of 1890 also produced a resounding victory at the polls for the party. Engels called it the beginning of the German Revolution. Since Engels felt assured of the steady and uninterrupted electoral growth of the German Socialist Party, his major tactical concern then was one of preservation and conservation. Only a catastrophe could halt the inevitable popular growth of the party, could halt the ultimate electoral victory. The tactics of the German Social Democrat must aim at the preservation of the party. Above all, Germany must avoid a war. Engels was explicit on these points. Quote, but whatever may happen in other countries, German social democracy has a special situation and therewith, at least in the first instance, a special task. The 2 million voters, whom it sends to the ballot box, together with the young men and women, who stand behind them as non-voters, form the most numerous, most compact mass, the decisive, quote, shock force, end quote, of the international proletarian army. This mass already supplies over a fourth of the recorded votes, and as the by-election to the Reichstag, the direct election in individual states, the municipal council and industrial court election demonstrate, it increases uninterruptedly, ... And there is only one means by which the steady rise of the socialist fighting forces in Germany could be momentarily halted, and even thrown back for some time. A clash on a big scale with the military, a bloodbath like that of 1871 in Paris. In the long run, that would also be overcome. To shoot out the world a party which numbered millions, all the magazine rifles of Europe and America, are not enough for this, end quote. Engels remained wedded to the policy of parliamentarianism. The enormous electoral growth of the party begged the preservation of the party. There were two ways in which the party could be destroyed: premature revolution and loss of an external war. To conserve the electoral power of the party required a continuation of the policy of parliamentarianism. When Engels did this, he opened wide the door to revisionism, which he himself was to pass through. Engels had worked himself into a tactical box. Engels had closed off most other tactical options. When Engels refused to investigate the revolutionary utility of other forms of violence, e.g. the general strike, when he refused to consider the revolutionary potential of the peasantry, Engels left himself with no tactical option other than the electoral politics. Engels was, in fact, the founder of the policy of gradualism, the policy of the German Social Democratic Party, and the policy of the Second International. The roots of Engels' gradualism lay in Engels' devotion to the proletariat as the only true revolutionary force. When Engels said proletariat, Engels meant exclusively the hardcore industrial working class. Engels tended to overestimate, to exaggerate the revolutionary elan of the industrial laborers. He was guilty of romanticizing the pauper. Engels remained bound throughout his life to Moses Hess's concept of class struggle as constituted of the warfare between rich and poor. But Engels also made the logical error of assuming that the pauper was always the rebel, always the incendiary. Most importantly, Engels failed to properly evaluate the revolutionary potential of the peasants. It was not, however, that Engels was entirely closed-minded on the question of the peasantry. It was rather his belief that before the peasantry could become revolutionary, they must first be transformed into a rural proletariat. The class struggle must be brought to the countryside. Polarization must take place between the landless wage-earning peasants and the rich middle-class land-owning peasants. In short, only when the peasant was pauperized would he become a revolutionary. Engels wrote his book, The Peasant War in Germany, not only as an illustration of historical materialism, but also for frankly political reasons. The Peasant War in Germany was written in 1850, 2 years after the failure of the 1848 revolution. It is clear to Engels, as it was clear to Marx, that the revolution of 1848 failed in part because the rural peasants turned against the urban proletariat. Thus Engels wrote The Peasant War in Germany in an attempt not only to lift the sagging revolutionary spirit inside Germany, but also to stress and illustrate the revolutionary tradition, and therefore revolutionary potential of the peasants themselves. In his 1870 preface to the second edition of The Peasant War in Germany, Engels called for a worker-peasant alliance. Based on previous experience, Engels understood that an urban insurrection would not succeed unless that urban insurrection was supported by the rural countryside. Here again, Engels used the revolutionary models of 1789, 1848, and 1871. Furthermore, Engels clearly foresaw the electoral majorities for the European social democratic parties would not come into being unless the great rural reservoir of peasant votes was won for the socialist parties. These peasant votes must be stripped from the feudal aristocratic parties. A worker-peasant alliance was the correct formula, but Engels then espoused a policy that made a worker-peasant alliance an impossibility. Land nationalization remained an uncompromisable principle in Engels' socialist platform. He would not deviate from the principle of land nationalization even to capture the votes of the landless peasants. Tactically, the implementation of a worker-peasant alliance required a temporary retreat from the policy of land nationalization. If the European peasants were to join the workers either in the battle of the ballot box or an actual insurrection, they must be promised what they wanted the most, land. But Engels indicated that the socialists could not promise to give land to the peasants, but must rather staunchly affirm the need for land nationalization, the policy that the peasants wanted least. Engels remained prisoner of the proletarian, urban model of class struggle. Engels saw the necessity of bringing the class struggle to the countryside, but the class struggle Engels saw was the class struggle of the great industrial centers, propertyless against capitalist wage labor, propertylist against capitalist, wage labor against proprietor. This model must be duplicated in the countryside. Therefore, just as the urban industrial working class called out for nationalization of the means of production, so the rural proletariat must call out for the nationalization of land. Consequently, Engels ultimately failed to appreciate the uniqueness of the peasant problem. In the last analysis, Engels failed to find the correct way to release the revolutionary nature of the peasantry. Because of his philosophy of history, Engels remained tied to the proletarian urban model of revolution. Because all societies must pass through capitalism in order to reach communism, Engels' eyes were focused on the development of large factories, on the development of an industrial working class near urban areas. Thus, Engels' unilinear view of history, by making capitalism a necessary precondition for communism, enslaved Engels to a proletarian urban formula of revolution. Furthermore, because of his social positivism, Engels was led to identify the fate of world socialism with the destiny of the German Social Democratic Party. Germany was the most industrialized country in Europe. Germany had the largest number of proletarians in Europe, and Germany had the strongest and most militant socialist party in Europe. It stood at the head of the European socialist movement. Since Europe was the most advanced section of the globe, the German proletariat was the vanguard of the world socialist movement. Engels' view of history supported his deep sense of German nationalism. Germany was to be the salvation of the world. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter, and now it's time for the footnotes. Footnote. For a description of the origins and onset of the Communist Revolution, see the following two works. Friedrich Engels, Anti-Düring, and Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Engels to J.P. Becker, June 15, 1885. Engels to Florence Kelly, Vishnevetsky, January 7th, 1886. Engels to Tarati, January 26, 1894. For further clarification of this point, see Engels' comments on the Erfurt program, which accompany his letter to Karl Kautsky. Engels' Anti-Dühring. Engels' Introduction to Marx's The Class Struggle in France, 1848 to 1850. Engels to August Bebel, October 28, 1882. Engels to Bebel, March 18th to 28th, 1875. Marx and Engels circular letter. Engels Brief Wechsel mit E. Bernstein. Engels to Zorga, February 8th, 1890. Engels to Zorga, April 19th, 1890. I'm not going to read every single letter. It's kind of stupid. Some letters to Lafargue, some letters to Laura Lafargue. Or was Laura Marx? Engels, The Peasant War in Germany. Engels, The Peasant Question in France and Germany. Okay, so that's the end. Thanks for listening. That's been chapter 11 of The Tragic Deception by Norman Levine.